Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. Today, I want to talk to you about a really cool book that's been one of the better-selling titles outside of the Marvel DC Image Comics bubble. And that is coming to us from Boom Studios. It's called Something is Killing the Children. With an evocative title like that, obviously, we're talking horror, and comics have a long history of being good to horror, from Tales from the Crypt through Walking Dead. It just has to be good, and Something is Killing the Children is very good. It's not perfect, but it's got a lot to recommend it. So today, I want to dive into that title and talk about the techniques that writer James Tynion and artist Werther Dell'edera are using to make it connect with audiences. Before we go too far, please consider hitting like and subscribe, and without any further ado, let's dive in. Something is Killing the Children is a monthly horror series that began in September of 2019. Writer James Tynion had started working in comics in 2012, and by 2019 was writing a lot of Batman titles for DC Comics, as well as Justice League Dark starting in 2018. He'd also written numerous creator-owned series for Boom Studios since 2014, with one of the most prominent being the young adult sci-fi book The Woods. Tynan had broken into comics because after studying creative writing in college at Sarah Lawrence College, he obtained an internship at DC, focusing on their Vertigo titles. He was an intern working under the esteemed Shelley Bond on titles like Fables. After some professional work in advertising, Scott Snyder invited Tynan to write some backup stories in his Batman title. There's a million ways to break into comics, and James Tynion did it through work opportunities and networking. And speaking of networking, how safe and secure is your VPN? Nah, I'm kidding again. I did that last week. I may do paid sponsorships someday, but for now, you're safe. And speaking of safe, how safe are the children in Something is Killing the Children? Oh! That is two flawless segues right in a row. Achievement unlocked. Back to the title. It follows children dying mysteriously in the remote Wisconsin town of Archer's Peak. As the police struggle to figure out what's going on, the enigmatic Erica Slaughter arrives, a monster hunter tasked with destroying the monsters, which can only be seen by children. She gets information from James, a young preteen survivor of an attack that killed his friends. Met with suspicion bordering on hostility, we learn that Erica has been trained to be a monster hunter for an organization called the Order of St. George, and she works for a prominent house within that order called the House of Slaughter, operating out of Chicago. The world building is impressive, as we get snippets of the chain of command and its purpose over the course of the first 15 issues story arc. The most important thing we learn is that Erica is more interested in saving lives in the moment, while the House of Slaughter is more concerned with containing the problem and making sure information about the existence of monsters does not get out. And they are ruthless about it, easily willing to kill people to keep problems contained. Erica begins dealing with two problems as they both escalate: the threat of the monsters and the threat of her superiors coming in to clean things up. While she's an excellent combatant, in this mission, Erica needs to rely on her wits to figure out solutions quickly and find allies rapidly before the bodies pile up too high. Okay, technically 3 problems. After fighting, she always stinks. It's a recurring gag in the book, and a light joke carries a lot of weight in a tense story. The book features a good mix of character arcs, world building, and well-paced tension, which is necessary for a horror story to work properly in comic book form. The horror in the book comes more from the ideas than explicitly the visuals, as in, the victims are children. And yes, you do sometimes get to see them killed, and you get to see bodies, but the visuals don't tend to linger on the violence. Maybe it could be more explicit, and that might be more effective. Your mileage may vary in that case. But does it do a good job in building tension? Yes. Does it do a good job in building likable characters that we care about? Yes. Something is Killing the Children is a good example of a good match between publisher and creator. Boom Studios has been supportive of the title, and they have a background in horror. In the early 2000s, two Hollywood producers, Ross Ritchie and Andrew Cosby, began thinking about getting into comics publishing after working to adapt various comics into film and television properties. In 2005, they launched Boom Studios, and the first book was a horror anthology title, Zombie Tales. They expanded into other genres like superheroes with titles like Hero Squared and Irredeemable. By 2006, they got into licensed titles, starting with Warhammer 40K and eventually moving into profitable properties like Power Rangers. In 2014, they began collaborating with Tynan, helping him secure an artist for his young adult sci-fi series The Woods, which ran for 36 issues. He's gone on to work on 8 different series with them, so clearly they have a close relationship, and they've really nurtured Something is Killing the Children. The book launched with a respectable 33,000 copies, dipping to around 16,000 copies, but by the time the first trade came out, numbers began climbing again, with issue 19 coming in just shy of 50,000 copies. That beats out a lot of Boom's more recognizable licensed properties like Dune, Power Rangers, and Firefly. And from the beginning, Boom has been building interest among collectors by issuing limited print-run variant covers by artists like Jenny Frison, Peach Momoko, and Jeff DeCaul. Gotta admit, my favorite is by Bill Sienkiewicz. Initially, James Tynion had actually pitched this series as a 5-issue limited series with Erica fighting a different monster in each issue. And I have a hard time envisioning what that version of the comic would have looked like, because I think that just would have been too compressed. It wouldn't have given the book the room it needs to build up that tension, to make you care about the characters, for the horror to be effective. But by the time the first issue came out, Boom Studios announced that it had actually made the comic book an ongoing series. The first arc takes 15 issues, and I would argue that's almost too much of an overcorrection compared to a 5-issue series. I'd say that after the first few issues, the story does slow down a bit for a few issues before closing out with a strong third act. I didn't dislike any part of the story, but if you read it monthly, it's a slow burn. It reads much better as a trade paperback collection. I want to dig into the techniques now that James Tynion uses as a writer on Something is Killing the Children. One thing he does well, in my opinion, is the pacing. As in, you are slowly teased out bits of information, and you as the audience know things ahead of the characters. It allows the tension to build slowly and organically because you know the threats before the character does. Something is Killing the Children does pacing well. An example of poor pacing would be interrupting a brilliant comic book analysis with a commercial break. While Tynan is still relatively new to comics, he's been prominent because DC assigned him the Batman title. The response has been pretty good, with strong sales and mostly good reviews. The issues he's been taken to task for are usually either too many characters drowning out motivations of the main characters, or disjointed pacing. And while I felt some of the middle part of Something is Killing the Children was slower, I didn't think it was bad. And there were never too many characters. We got to meet grieving parents to drive home the stakes. We are introduced to a town sheriff in over his head, which helps place the responsibility of saving the day on Erica. We meet some children and get to know them, so that we have characters we could lose and don't want to. There are also deputies and relatives of victims who are obstacles for Erica, but that doesn't make them inherently bad people. It just makes her have to work to solve problems, instead of just moving from fight to fight. And there's the House of Slaughter, Erica's devious bosses. Each of these fulfills an important storytelling role. The police represent an important trope in a lot of horror, where the people in charge won't believe the hero. But in this story, that's a bit more nuanced, as they have their doubts but aren't outright locking Erica up and calling her a liar. Instead, they represent adults not being able to put themselves in the shoes of the kids, just unable to believe James's story about monsters. And James is an interesting character. He tells his friends stories, he's probably gay, and his name is James. Yes, he's clearly a self-insert of writer James Tynion. But that's okay, because James isn't the protagonist. He's the viewpoint character we, the readers, align with. We follow him from the beginning, and his response to monsters, to meeting Erica, to facing the dangers and learning the mysteries of the unseen world represent our response. It's cathartic. James and another survivor, Bean, are the surviving victims. They learn the world is a darker place than they knew. That's one of the themes of this book, a loss of innocence. It's teased out that Erica was brought into the House of Slaughter after surviving a similar event. And the House of Slaughter knows what's going on, but their solutions are overly complicated. Those solutions rely on bringing in more and more of their people, trying to suppress the truth through both technical means, blacking out cell phones in the area, and through physical intimidation of the locals. The police may not be effective fighting the monsters, but their hearts are always in the right place. So when we compare the two authority figures, one is clearly representing bureaucratic corruption, and the other is small-town caring. A country versus city motif, you could say. In terms of positives, I'd say that Tynan's writing gives us an interesting and challenging main character. She can be a bit of a jerk, but is also ready to apologize and try to be better. The world building is interesting, and so far it's very effective because we just get teases of who the House of Slaughter is, how they work, and what monsters are out there. Also, there is an explanation of sorts for where the monsters come from, and it raises the stakes. It makes the world a more dangerous place when we learn about them. The book also takes some time to show us the effects of the horrors on regular people. It shows us the importance of sacrifice as well. Moving over to negatives, I'd list the slight pacing issues in the first arc. But there's an excellent chance that those issues were precipitated by outside factors. Making the book an ongoing so late in the process probably forced Tynan to stretch the story out a little bit to give him some breathing room. And I'd also say that it only really is noticeable when reading the title monthly. As trades, it works very well. And then I'd ask the question, is this book too violent? Or is the violence against the children justified? I'm jaded with horror, and I wouldn't mind it becoming a little more extreme. But I don't think children should be off limits in horror, because that's just about as extreme as stakes can get. There's a reason so many horror movies have a final girl. It's because she represents vulnerability, and so do children. The trick is making us care about the survivors and showing the effects on real people that death has, because that's something we can all relate to. It wouldn't be fair to talk about this book without talking about the artwork by Werther Dell'edera and colorist Miquel Muerto. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I'm just kidding. Let's get into talking about the artwork. You've been looking at the artwork throughout the review, so you're familiar with the scratchy but energetic style. It feels appropriate for a horror book. Not too clean, but also not dull. In terms of criticisms I'll aim at the book, I'd say that some characters are a bit generic. Some of the townspeople and police don't stand out too much from one another. This restaurant server and this deputy are fairly close. But that helps the children and Erica stand out that much more. Your mileage may vary on this next one, but I thought that the overall monster design here was also not the strongest. As a shape, it's effective. Spindly insect-like legs with a powerful body, large jaws, and multiple sets of eyes. Bugs are a creepy starting point, but they're almost all black. If they were just hiding in caves or the woods, that might work. But the monsters eventually get bold and go out into town. The lack of detail, just being amorphous black blobs with a bunch of legs, isn't outright bad in any way, but I hope future monsters have more texture and definition. Let's move on to the positives. First of all, Erica's design is fantastic, and the artist clearly cares about her. She looks real, not too much like a supermodel or an overly muscled superhero. Erica's dark eyes let us know how tired she is from this life. She wears her hair parted over one side of her face, so we often only see one intense eye. But there's a reason for that. We later learn members of the House of Slaughter have a brand on their temple that allows them to see monsters. Erica likes to hide that. One of the best visual aids to the character is her bandana mask. Tynan says he wrote that she simply had a bandana, but that Dell'edera added the distinctive teeth, which, along with color, help distinguish status and jobs within the House of Slaughter. So that small addition helped with the world building. The pacing in terms of the storytelling is also very strong, page to page. In order to build the world or add to the tension, we have to have exposition scenes. A lot of these are communicated with 2-page spreads that read all the way across both pages from left to right. It forces you as a reader to pause for a moment longer and really pay attention to what's being said. And it makes the occasional splash page with action that much more exciting and impactful. Dell'edera also frequently uses negative space to great effect. The color palette is grounded, earthy tones. It just means that when there's blood, it stands out just a little bit more. So what's the future of Something is Killing the Children? I hope it can grow. Certainly stories like Hellboy or Buffy the Vampire Slayer feature monster hunters going up against bigger threats and finding new ways to explore the character and those around them. So there could be a lot of life left in this title. The second story arc is a flashback that helps flesh out Erica's origin, which I think works very well. Just this past week, James Tynion and Boom Studios launched a spin-off title, House of Slaughter. I hope that they don't oversaturate the market with this, but I certainly don't think they're doing that yet. 2 titles in the world is not too many. Not when you compare it to how many books a month you get for Avengers, X-Men, Batman. The balance is that in horror, once you become too familiar with something, it loses its scariness. Certainly, if Freddy Krueger has taught us anything, it's that.
Great graphics.
Folks, thank you so much for watching this episode. If it wasn't clear, yeah, I give Something is Killing the Children my recommendation. I think it's good horror. This is a fun monthly title. I'm glad I discovered it. I love it. I really do. Behind the scenes, I want you to know that I am working to do weekly videos. I have stepped down to part-time at my day job so that I can focus more on my YouTube content and continue to deliver you weekly episodes. It's a big step for me. I've definitely got a little bit of nervousness there. But I am also doing weekly live streams Monday at 5 p.m. Pacific on my second channel. You can find a description for that channel, pros and cons, in the description below. What I do there is I take 20 to 30 minutes to quickly review any comics I've read in the past week, and then I draw something while taking questions from the audience. I'd love to have your support. If you're in a position to help out, I'd also love it if you could say support Patreon. If you're not, that's fine, but I'm trying to do this as more of my career. Health insurance is definitely not cheap, so any support you can give is certainly appreciated at this time. Anyway, with all that said, thank you so much for watching this episode. It means a lot to me. Comment down below if you're reading this book, and if not, like what some of your favorite horror titles are. Or if you're reading anything else by these creators. I'd also be curious to hear your opinions on that. And without anything else to say, I guess I'll just leave it with keep reading comics. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please consider hitting like and subscribe. If you'd like to support the show, there are merchandise links beneath the YouTube video, and you can always hit join on YouTube or visit Comic Tropes on Patreon to get access to special perks.